What would you do if your friends pulled a prank that ended someone's life and blamed it all on you? My friend group spent months planning our senior prank, and I spent those same months telling them it was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard. The ringleader was my best friend Santos, who decided our legacy would be putting Principal Wang's car on the school roof using a construction crane. I kept pointing out the obvious problems with this plan. The roof might collapse, someone could get hurt, we'd all get arrested. But Santos had watched YouTube videos of other schools doing it, and he'd found some guy who could operate a crane for $200. The rest of our group thought it was genius. Every time we met to plan, I was the only one saying we shouldn't do it. Santos would roll his eyes and tell me I was being paranoid. "The roof is solid," he'd say, like he was suddenly a structural engineer. I was outvoted 6-1 every single time. The night of the prank, I showed up at the school parking lot at 2 in the morning hoping I could still stop them. They were all there waiting. The crane was already set up with some sketchy 20-year-old guy in the driver's seat. Principal Wang's car was hooked up and ready to go. I immediately started yelling that this was insane and someone was going to get seriously hurt or killed. Santos told me to either help or leave. I refused to leave because I genuinely thought they might hurt themselves. We argued in that parking lot for over an hour. I told them the roof wouldn't support the weight of a car. I told them they were being reckless and stupid. I threatened to call the police. Finally, Santos threw his hands up. "Fine, you win. We won't do it. Are you happy now?" I made all of them promise they wouldn't put the car on the roof. Every single one of them looked me in the eye and promised. The crane operator packed up and left. Everyone went home. I drove away thinking I'd actually stop them from doing something horrible. The next morning, I pulled into the school parking lot and saw police cars everywhere. My stomach completely dropped. There was a massive hole in the roof above the main building. Principal Wang's car was sticking halfway out of the collapsed section like some kind of nightmare. Ambulances and fire trucks were parked all over the place. I watched them carry out a body bag on a stretcher. The school janitor had come in early that morning to clean and was working directly under where the roof collapsed. The car fell right on top of him. He died instantly. A detective pulled me aside and asked me questions about last night. I told him everything. My friends planned the prank, but I stopped them. They promised they wouldn't do it. Then he showed me his phone. Screenshots from Santos's messages, texts between me and Santos where I was supposedly pressuring him to help with the prank, saying it would be legendary, that I'd already paid the crane operator. I stared at them in complete shock. "Those are fake," I said. "I never sent any of those messages." But they looked completely real with timestamps and everything. The detective told me all my friends were telling the same story. That I was obsessed with this prank. That I planned everything and knew the crane operator. That I wouldn't listen when they begged me not to do it. They said they only showed up last night to try to stop me one last time. I had no proof of what actually happened because all our conversations were in person. My parents couldn't afford a real lawyer, so I got stuck with a public defender who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Santos's dad was a lawyer and coached all of them on exactly what to say. The trial started 3 months later. One by one, every single person I thought was my friend took the stand and lied under oath. Santos actually cried while talking about how hard he tried to be a good friend and stop this tragedy from happening. They showed the jury the fake text messages. The prosecutor called me a reckless kid who caused a man to lose his life because I wanted to be remembered. My public defender barely asked any questions. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury went to deliberate. I sat in that courtroom watching them file out, knowing that 6 people who were supposed to be my best friends had just destroyed my entire life to save themselves. But when the jury came out, I found out my lawyer actually had one last trick up his sleeve. The jury filed back in after 3 hours, and my public defender leaned close to whisper that I needed to stay calm no matter what happened next. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to grip the edge of the table to keep them still. I could feel Santos watching me from the gallery where he sat with Jax and Kayla and the others. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the forewoman stood up. She said they were deadlocked on the main charge. My lawyer shot to his feet immediately and asked for a sidebar. I watched him walk up to the bench and pull out his phone to show the judge and prosecutor something on the screen. The prosecutor had been standing there looking confident like she'd already won, but her whole posture changed as she stared at whatever my lawyer was showing them. Her shoulders came forward and her face went pale. She leaned in closer to look at the phone, and then looked at my lawyer with this shocked expression. When they came back from the sidebar, my lawyer asked the judge for permission to present new evidence that had just come to light during the deliberation. The courtroom got really quiet. My lawyer explained that he'd hired a digital forensics expert to analyze the text messages Santos had provided as evidence. The expert found problems with the metadata that proved the messages were created using editing software. The timestamps didn't match up with actual cell tower data from that night. The message IDs didn't exist in the phone company's records at all. Santos's father jumped up from his seat shouting objections, but the judge told him to sit down or leave the courtroom immediately. I could see Santos's face from where I was sitting, and he looked sick. The prosecutor asked for a recess to review this new evidence, and the judge gave her 2 hours while keeping the jury in a separate room. A bailiff took me to a holding room, and my lawyer came in right after. He finally explained what he'd been doing for the past few weeks. He said something about Santos's testimony felt rehearsed and fake, so he started investigating on his own time. He'd tracked down the actual crane operator who did the prank. The guy confirmed that I'd left hours before they came back to do it. He said Santos called him around 4 in the morning and paid him extra money to come back and lift the car onto the roof. When court started again 2 hours later, the prosecutor stood up and made this announcement that shocked everyone. She said she was moving to dismiss the main charges against me based on evidence of fabricated testimony and witness tampering. The courtroom just exploded with noise. Reporters started rushing toward the doors to file their stories. Santos's father grabbed Santos by the arm and tried to pull him toward the exit, but the judge banged her gavel and ordered everyone to stay seated. She had to yell for order 3 times before people finally settled down. The judge asked the prosecutor if she wanted to pursue perjury charges against the witnesses who gave false testimony. The prosecutor said her office would be investigating everyone involved in the coordinated lies. She looked right at Santos and his father when she said it. The judge told Santos and the other 5 that they couldn't leave town because they were now subjects of a criminal investigation. I watched Santos's face go completely white as he realized what was happening. His father was whispering something to him, but Santos just stared straight ahead like he was in shock. The judge formally dismissed the case against me with something called prejudice, which my lawyer said meant they could never charge me again for this. She apologized to me for what I'd been through. I heard my mom crying in the gallery behind me, and my dad was trying to comfort her. I felt like I might actually throw up from the sudden release of all that pressure I'd been carrying for months. My lawyer reached over and shook my hand. He told me to go home and try to rest because the aftermath was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us with cameras and microphones. My dad had to physically put himself between me and them to get us to the car. Someone shouted a question about whether I was going to sue Santos and the others. My lawyer had told me not to make any statements yet, so I just kept my head down and kept walking. The drive home felt completely surreal after spending months convinced I was going to prison for something I didn't do. My mom kept reaching back from the front seat to squeeze my hand. When we got home, I went straight to my room and collapsed on my bed. I just stared at the ceiling trying to process that I was actually free. My phone started buzzing constantly with messages from people I hadn't heard from in months. Some were apologizing for believing I was guilty. Some were asking questions about what happened. Some were actually accusing me of somehow manipulating the system to get away with it. I turned my phone completely off and tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying Santos crying on the witness stand during my trial. The next morning, my mom came into my room and showed me her phone with the local news coverage. They were calling it a stunning reversal and questioning how the case got so far with fabricated evidence. The school district had released a statement saying they were cooperating with investigations into what actually happened that night. I realized I still had to face going back to the school eventually, where everyone had watched me get arrested and assumed I was guilty. 2 days later, my lawyer called while I was sitting in my room staring at the ceiling. He said the prosecutor wanted to meet with me about testifying against Santos and the others in their perjury case. His voice was professional, but I could tell he thought I should do it. He explained it was completely my choice, but my testimony could help make sure they faced real consequences for what they did to me. I held the phone against my ear and felt this weird mix of anger and exhaustion. Part of me wanted to see them all punished for destroying my life. But another part of me just wanted to forget any of this ever happened and move on. I told him I needed time to think about it. He said to take all the time I needed and call him when I decided. After we hung up, I lay back down and tried to imagine sitting in another courtroom watching Santos again. My stomach felt sick just thinking about it. 3 days after the dismissal, I finally left the house to go to the grocery store with my mom. We'd been ordering everything online because I couldn't face going out in public, but my mom said I needed to start getting back to normal life eventually. The store felt too bright and too loud after hiding in my room for days. People stared at me in the aisles. Some looked away quickly when I caught them watching. Others just kept staring like I was some kind of exhibit. My mom kept her hand on the shopping cart and tried to act like everything was normal. We were in the produce section when this older woman approached us. She touched my arm and said she never believed I did it, and she was so glad justice prevailed. Her voice was kind, but it made me feel weird having a stranger talk about my trial. I mumbled thanks and she walked away smiling. We moved toward the checkout line and I could hear people whispering. This man in line behind us muttered something about getting away with it loud enough for me to hear clearly. My mom's hand shot out and grabbed my arm. She pulled me toward the exit without buying anything. The cart sat abandoned in the aisle. We got to the car and she was shaking. I realized this was almost as hard for her as it was for me. The school called the next morning while I was eating breakfast. My mom answered and I watched her face as she listened. She covered the phone and told me the school was saying I could return to classes. They were offering homebound instruction if I preferred to finish the semester remotely given the circumstances. She asked what I wanted to do. I thought about walking those hallways where everyone had watched me get arrested. I thought about sitting in classrooms with kids who'd assumed I was guilty. I told her I wanted to do remote learning. She relayed my choice to whoever was on the phone and hung up. That afternoon, my teachers started sending assignments through email. I threw myself into the schoolwork as a distraction from everything else. Math problems and history essays felt simple compared to what I'd been through. I stayed up late finishing assignments and barely left my room except for meals. 4 days after that, Detective Anderson showed up at our house. My dad answered the door and I heard their voices in the entryway. Anderson asked if he could talk to me and my dad called me downstairs. The detective looked uncomfortable standing in our living room. He apologized in person for not investigating the fake texts more carefully from the beginning. He explained that Santos's father's reputation as a lawyer made him assume the evidence was solid. He should have dug deeper instead of taking everything at face value. Then he asked if I was willing to tell him everything I remembered about the planning meetings and that night in the parking lot. My dad sat with me while I gave Anderson a detailed statement. I walked him through every planning session where I argued against the prank. I described that night in exact detail, including every word of the argument and the promises they all made. Anderson recorded everything on his phone and took notes. 2 hours later, when we finished, he thanked me and said this would help build the case against Santos and his father. He left, and I felt drained like I'd relived the whole nightmare again. A week after my case was dismissed, the prosecutor filed perjury and conspiracy charges against Santos, Jax, Kayla, Holden, Estelle, and Jeremy. The news broke on a Tuesday afternoon. My mom saw it first on her phone and showed me the article. Santos's father was also under investigation for witness tampering and obstruction of justice. I sat on the couch and watched the local news coverage. The reporter stood outside the courthouse talking about how all 6 former friends were facing serious criminal charges. I felt this grim satisfaction seeing their names listed as defendants instead of witnesses. But I also felt sad that it came to this. These were people I'd known since middle school. Santos had been my best friend. Now they were all facing jail time because they chose to lie. The satisfaction felt hollow, mixed with the sadness of losing friendships I thought would last forever. The next day, Santos's lawyer released a statement to the media. It claimed Santos was confused and traumatized by the tragedy and wasn't deliberately lying. The statement said the charges were vindictive and that Santos was just a kid trying to cope with witnessing a death. I was watching the news when Santos's father came on screen playing the victim. He talked about how his son was suffering and how the prosecutor was going after them to cover up her own mistakes. I grabbed a pillow off the couch and threw it at the TV screen. My dad walked in and found me standing there breathing hard. He picked up the remote and turned off the television. He told me to stop torturing myself with the coverage. He was right, but I couldn't help checking the news constantly to see what they were saying. 2 days later, Mrs. Smith gave an interview on the local news. I almost didn't watch it, but my mom said I should hear what she had to say. Mrs. Smith sat in her living room and talked about her husband. She said she wanted the truth about what really happened to him. She'd never felt right about the case against me from the beginning. Something about it didn't add up. She said the people actually responsible needed to be held accountable for taking her husband's life. Watching her talk made my chest tight. I went to my room and wrote her a letter expressing my sorrow for her loss. I explained that I tried to stop the prank that night. I told her about arguing with them in the parking lot and making them promise not to do it. I described how I drove away thinking I'd actually stopped them. The letter was 3 pages long by the time I finished, but I couldn't bring myself to mail it. It sat on my desk for days while I stared at it, wondering if my words would mean anything to her. 2 weeks into remote learning, my school counselor called to check on my mental health. She asked how I was coping with everything that happened. I told her I was fine and just focused on finishing my schoolwork. She said she was concerned about me processing the trauma of false accusation and betrayal. She suggested I might benefit from therapy. I resisted at first because I didn't want to be seen as damaged or broken. I told her I could handle it on my own. She said there was no shame in getting help and that what I went through was serious trauma. After we hung up, my mom came into my room. She'd been listening from the hallway. She convinced me to try at least one session with a therapist who worked with people dealing with legal stress. I agreed mostly to make her stop worrying. The therapist's office was in a quiet building downtown. She specialized in trauma from false accusations and wrongful arrests. I sat in her office expecting to hate it. But when I started talking to her about the trial and the betrayal, it actually helped. She understood in a way other people didn't. By the end of the session, I agreed to come back the following week. 3 weeks after my dismissal, Jax's mom contacted my parents. She called my dad's phone one evening while we were eating dinner. My dad stepped into the other room to take the call. I could hear his voice getting louder. He came back to the table looking angry. He told my mom that Jax's mother wanted us all to meet so Jax could apologize. Apparently, Jax was having a breakdown over the guilt. My dad had immediately refused. He told her that Jax should have thought about guilt before committing perjury and destroying my life. He said we had no interest in making Jax feel better about his choices. I sat at the table listening to my dad defend me and felt this twisted sense of validation. At least one of them was suffering like I'd suffered. At least one of them couldn't sleep at night. Part of me knew that was wrong to feel good about someone else's pain. But after what they did to me, I couldn't find it in myself to care about Jax's guilt. 4 weeks after my case was dismissed, the crane operator finally came forward publicly. The news reported that he'd given a statement to police with his lawyer present. He said Santos contacted him 2 hours after I left that night. Santos paid him $500 to come back and do the prank anyway. The operator said Santos told him I had changed my mind and approved it, which is why he agreed to return. This corroborated everything my lawyer had suspected. It proved Santos orchestrated the whole thing and then blamed me when it went wrong. The operator's statement showed Santos had lied about everything from the very beginning. I watched the news coverage and felt vindicated, but also angry that it took this long for the truth to come out. If the operator had told the truth immediately, I never would have been arrested or gone to trial. But at least now everyone knew exactly what Santos had done. 2 days later, my lawyer called while I was eating breakfast. He said Kayla's attorney reached out about a deal. She wanted to testify against Santos if the prosecutor would give her reduced charges. My lawyer asked how I felt about one of them getting leniency for cooperating. I gripped my phone and thought about it for a minute. I told him I wanted Santos held responsible most of all. If Kayla's testimony helped make that happen, I could accept her getting a lighter sentence. My lawyer said he'd pass that along to the prosecutor. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my eggs. My mom asked if I was okay. I nodded, but couldn't really explain how it felt, knowing one of them might actually tell the truth now. That night, I had the first nightmare. I was back in the courtroom watching Santos cry on the witness stand. In the dream, I kept trying to yell that he was lying, but no sound came out of my mouth. The jury kept nodding like they believed every word. I woke up sweating and breathing hard. My heart was racing so fast I thought something was wrong with me. I checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. I couldn't fall back asleep for hours. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was on the stand and the prosecutor was yelling questions at me while Santos and the others laughed. I woke up shouting and heard my mom run down the hallway. She came into my room and turned on the light. I was shaking and couldn't catch my breath. She sat on my bed and held my hand until I calmed down. At my next therapy session, I told my therapist about the nightmares. She said this was completely normal after what I'd been through. She called it a trauma response. My brain was processing everything that happened. She taught me grounding techniques for when the anxiety hit. She had me name 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, and 1 thing I could taste. It actually helped when I woke up panicking. But some nights were worse than others. My parents started hearing me shout in my sleep. My mom would come sit with me until my breathing went back to normal. I felt bad for keeping them awake, but I couldn't control it. A month after the dismissal, the school called to say I needed to take final exams in person. It was required for graduation. I'd been doing remote learning since the trial ended. The thought of walking into that building made my stomach hurt. But I didn't have a choice. My dad drove me there on exam day. I sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes trying to make myself get out of the car. When I finally walked through the front doors, the hallway went completely quiet. Everyone stopped talking and stared at me. I kept my eyes down and walked fast toward the testing room. I could feel people watching me the entire way. During a break between exams, I went to the bathroom. 2 girls were standing by the sinks talking. They didn't notice me come in. One of them said she didn't think I was guilty, and that Santos obviously framed me. The other girl argued back that maybe I just got off on a technicality. She said the text looked real and 6 people testified against me. The first girl said those people all lied and admitted it. They kept going back and forth while I stood frozen in the stall. I waited until they left before coming out. I finished my last 2 exams as fast as possible. I didn't look at anyone on the way out. My dad was waiting in the parking lot. I got in the car and told him I was never going back there. That night, I was scrolling through social media when a message notification popped up. It was from Estelle. My finger hovered over it for a second before I opened it. She wrote that she was sorry for what happened. She said Santos pressured all of them by promising his dad would protect them if they stuck together. She claimed she wanted to tell the truth but was scared of going to jail herself. She said she hoped I could forgive her someday. I read the message 3 times. Part of me wanted to respond and ask why she thought an apology would fix anything. Part of me wanted to tell her exactly how those months felt. But mostly I just felt tired. I stared at the message for almost an hour. My mom came in to say goodnight and asked what I was looking at. I showed her the message. She read it and shook her head. She said it was up to me whether to respond, but that I didn't owe Estelle anything. I thought about it for another few minutes. Then I blocked her account without typing a single word back. Her apology meant nothing now. She'd had plenty of chances to tell the truth, and she chose to lie instead. 3 days later, my lawyer called again. The prosecutor offered Santos a plea deal. He could plead guilty to perjury and conspiracy. He'd get probation and community service. In exchange, he had to testify about his father's role in coaching everyone's testimony. My lawyer said Santos rejected the offer. He apparently still believed his father could get him off completely. I asked what that meant for me. My lawyer explained we were probably going to trial again, but this time I'd be testifying against them instead of defending myself. The thought of going back to court made me feel sick. But at least this time I wouldn't be the one facing prison. My lawyer said Santos was making a huge mistake by not taking the deal. The evidence against him was strong. I hung up and told my parents what happened. My dad got angry and said Santos was still being protected by his father's arrogance. My mom said eventually they'd both have to face reality. 2 weeks later, the school sent out an email announcement. Principal was retiring at the end of the school year. The message said he was stepping down because of stress from the tragedy and investigation. The school board also issued a formal apology to Mr. Smith's family and to me. They said there was a failure of supervision that allowed the prank to happen. I read the apology 3 times and felt nothing. It seemed hollow. An apology didn't bring Mr. Smith back. It didn't give me those months of terror back. It didn't undo the damage to my reputation. My therapist said I was right to feel that way. She said sometimes apologies are more about making the person giving them feel better than actually helping the victim. The school board probably needed to say something for legal reasons. That didn't mean it had any real meaning. A few days after that, Mrs. Smith reached out through my lawyer. She wanted to meet with me if I was willing. My lawyer said it was completely my choice. I agreed because I felt like I owed her that much. We met at a coffee shop downtown. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. We sat in a corner booth away from other people. She told me about her husband. She said he loved his job keeping the school clean. He took pride in making sure everything looked nice for the students. He'd worked there for 15 years. She showed me pictures on her phone of him at the school events. In one photo, he was smiling while talking to a group of kids. She said she believed I tried to stop the prank. She said she didn't blame me for what happened. I started crying right there in the coffee shop. She reached across the table and held my hand. She said the people actually responsible needed to answer for it. We both cried together for a while. Then she asked if I would come to a memorial service the school was planning. I promised her I would. When we left the coffee shop, she hugged me. I felt some of the weight lift off my chest. Her forgiveness meant more than any apology from the school board. The next week, the news reported that Kayla accepted a plea deal. She agreed to testify against Santos and his father. In exchange, she got probation and no jail time. The news said she told prosecutors about practice sessions. Santos's father held multiple meetings where he drilled them on their testimony. He coached them on how to appear believable on the stand. He told them exactly what to say and how to say it. My stomach turned reading about it. The whole thing was so calculated. It wasn't just a panicked lie, it was an organized plan to destroy my life. Santos's father had used his legal training to frame an innocent person. I thought about all those hours in court listening to them lie. Every detail had been rehearsed. Every tear had been planned. I felt sick thinking about how much effort they put into ruining me. At my next therapy session, I told my therapist about the news. We talked about my anger towards Santos specifically. She asked me to really think about what hurt the most. I realized it wasn't just the betrayal. It was that he was willing to let me go to prison to save himself. He was my best friend since middle school. We'd spent years together, and he looked me in the eye in that courtroom and lied without hesitation. My therapist asked if I'd thought about what I wanted to say to him if I got the chance. I told her I honestly didn't know. I couldn't find words big enough for that kind of betrayal. How do you tell someone they destroyed your entire world? She said I didn't have to have an answer yet. She said when the time came, I'd know what needed to be said. 3 months after my case got dismissed, the news broke that Santos's father was charged. The prosecutor filed obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy charges against him. He was immediately suspended from practicing law until his case was resolved. The news coverage was huge. Local stations ran stories about how a respected attorney orchestrated an elaborate frame job. Legal experts came on TV saying he could face disbarment and serious prison time. Some lawyers they interviewed said they'd never seen anything like it. One said the legal community was shocked that someone would abuse their knowledge this way. I watched the coverage with my parents. My dad said it was about time. My mom said she hoped he got the maximum sentence. I just felt exhausted by the whole thing. Every new development meant more attention and more reminders of what happened. I wanted it to be over, but it just kept going. A week later, I got a call from someone at a victim advocacy group that works with people who were wrongly accused. She explained they offer free counseling and support groups. She asked if I wanted to talk to someone else who went through something similar. I agreed because talking to my therapist helped, but she'd never been falsely accused herself. They connected me with a guy named Noah who spent 2 years in prison before DNA evidence cleared him. We talked on the phone for over an hour. He told me about the anger and the nightmares and how hard it was to trust anyone again. He said even after he got out, some people in his town still thought he was guilty. They just assumed he got lucky with the evidence. He warned me that legal victory doesn't erase what people believe. Some folks would always think I got away with something. That conversation helped more than I expected because Noah understood in a way nobody else could. 2 weeks after that call, my lawyer contacted me with news that Holden and Jeremy accepted plea deals. They both agreed to testify against Santos and his father in exchange for probation and community service. That left only Santos and his father fighting the charges. My lawyer explained their cases would be tried together since the conspiracy involved both of them working together to frame me. He said the prosecution wanted me to testify about all the planning meetings where I objected to the prank. They needed me to describe that night in the parking lot and the promises everyone made before going home. I told him I was ready. I'd been waiting months to tell the truth in a courtroom where it actually mattered. I finally pulled out the letter I'd written to Mrs. Smith weeks earlier. I added a note about the memorial service and told her how much her forgiveness meant to me. I explained that knowing she didn't blame me helped me sleep at night. I walked to the mailbox and dropped it in before I could change my mind. 3 days later, I got a letter back from her. She thanked me for reaching out and said knowing the real truth about what happened gave her some peace. She said she could finally understand how her husband died instead of wondering if the whole story was lies. She included a photo of her husband at a school event. He was smiling while talking to a group of students. Looking at his face made everything feel more real. This wasn't just about me and my former friends. A good man died because of their stupid prank. The school announced the memorial service would be held in the auditorium on a Saturday afternoon. My parents asked if I wanted to go. Part of me wanted to avoid it because I knew some of the others might show up. But I'd promised Mrs. Smith I would attend. We drove to the school and walked into the auditorium where hundreds of people were already seated. Mrs. Smith saw me come in and walked over. She asked if I would sit with her family in the front row. My mom looked at me to see if I was okay with that. I nodded and followed Mrs. Smith to the front. I could feel every eye in that auditorium on us as we walked down the aisle. People whispered and pointed. Mrs. Smith held my arm like I was family. We sat down and I looked around for Santos but didn't see him. Kayla was sitting in the back corner crying. The service lasted an hour with people sharing stories about Mr. Smith. Teachers talked about how dedicated he was. Students remembered how he always said good morning. Mrs. Smith spoke about their life together. I sat there feeling the weight of what happened pressing down on me. After the memorial, my lawyer called to schedule testimony preparation sessions. We met at his office 3 times that week. He had me practice answering questions about the planning meetings and that night in the parking lot. He asked the same questions over and over in different ways. He warned me that Santos's defense attorney would try to make me look like I was seeking revenge. They'd suggest I was actually involved and now I was lying to get back at Santos for testifying against me. He taught me to stay calm and stick to facts no matter how aggressive the questioning got. We practiced for hours until I could answer without getting emotional or defensive. He said the key was to sound honest and consistent. Let the jury see I was telling the truth while Santos's story kept changing. Between testimony prep sessions, I started thinking about college applications. My counselor scheduled a meeting to discuss my options. Sitting in her office, I realized I had no idea what I wanted to study anymore. The entire last year of high school got consumed by this nightmare. All my friends were planning their futures while I was fighting to stay out of prison. My counselor pulled up application websites and helped me start filling out basic information. She explained I could address what happened in my personal statement if I wanted to. Some colleges might see it as a red flag, but others would understand. I decided to write about resilience and fighting for truth when everyone doubts you. I wrote about learning that standing up for what's right matters even when you're outvoted. The essay practically wrote itself because I'd lived it. One afternoon, I got a message from someone I barely knew saying Jax wanted to meet with me. He was begging for a chance to apologize in person and explain why he went along with Santos's plan. My first instinct was to refuse. My parents definitely thought I should refuse. But something made me agree to meet him in a coffee shop with my dad sitting at the next table. Jax showed up looking terrible. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes. His hands shook when he sat down across from me. His apology came out in this rambling, desperate mess of words. He kept saying he was sorry and that he thought about what he did every single day. I could tell the guilt was eating him alive. Part of me felt satisfied seeing him suffer. Part of me just felt tired of the whole thing. I let him finish his apology, then asked him to explain exactly what happened. Jax told me Santos convinced all of them that his father could build such a strong case against me that I'd take a plea deal to avoid trial. Santos promised they'd just get probation for being witnesses. He said none of them thought it would actually go to trial. They definitely didn't think I'd face serious prison time. Jax claimed they thought I'd plead guilty to some minor charge and get community service. I stared at him across the table. I told him that didn't make what he did any better. He still chose to lie under oath. He still sat in that courtroom and watched me suffer for weeks. He still knew I was innocent and said nothing. Jax started crying and said he knew. He said there was no excuse for what he did. I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind for months. Why did Santos pick me to blame? I was the one trying to stop them. I was the one warning them someone would get hurt. Jax wiped his eyes and explained that Santos panicked when the janitor died. His father told him he needed a scapegoat, someone who was there that night but didn't actually do the prank. I was perfect because I'd been arguing against it so loudly. They could twist my objections into obsession, make it look like I was so focused on the prank that I became reckless trying to make it happen. My warnings about the roof collapsing became proof I knew it was dangerous, but did it anyway. Jax said Santos's father came up with the whole strategy in the first few hours after the death. He coached them on exactly how to spin my opposition into guilt. Listening to Jax explain it made me feel sick. The whole frame job was so calculated and deliberate. 4 months after my case got dismissed, I walked back into that same courthouse for Santos and his father's trial. The prosecutor called me as their first witness. Walking through those courthouse doors brought back every terrible memory from my own trial. I sat in the witness waiting room trying to stay calm. When they called my name, I walked into the courtroom and saw Santos sitting at the defense table with his father, the same seats where I'd sat watching my life fall apart. I took the stand and got sworn in. The prosecutor asked me to tell the jury about the planning meetings. I described every session where Santos pushed for the prank while I argued against it. I explained how I was always outvoted 6-1. I told them about that night in the parking lot, how I showed up trying to stop them, how we argued for over an hour, how Santos finally promised they wouldn't do it, how everyone looked me in the eye and made that same promise. I described driving away thinking I'd actually prevented something horrible. Then I told them about the next morning, the police cars and the ambulance, the body bag, finding out Mr. Smith was dead. The prosecutor let me talk without interruption. I looked directly at the jury while I spoke. I wanted them to see I was telling the truth. Santos's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination and walked toward me with this confident look on his face. He asked why anyone should believe me now when 6 people had told a consistent story at my trial. I took a breath and explained calmly that those 6 witnesses had all admitted they lied under oath. 5 of them had already pleaded guilty to perjury charges. The attorney kept pushing, suggesting I was making this up to get revenge on Santos. The prosecutor jumped up and objected, saying the defense was badgering the witness. The judge sustained the objection and told the attorney to move on. I stepped down from the witness stand, feeling like I'd finally gotten to tell my side without being twisted around. The prosecution called Kayla next, and I watched her walk to the stand looking pale and sick. She got sworn in and sat down, not looking at Santos even once. The prosecutor asked her to describe the meetings with Santos's father after the janitor died. Kayla's voice shook as she explained how Santos's father had called them all to his office. He'd shown them fake text messages he'd created using some kind of software. He'd drilled them on exactly what to say and how to stay consistent with each other. She described practice sessions where he'd ask them questions over and over until they had the story memorized. The prosecutor asked if she understood she was committing perjury when she testified at my trial. Kayla started crying and said yes, she knew it was wrong. She said she thought about what she did every single day. She talked about Mr. Smith's family and how ashamed she felt for lying about his death. I looked over at Santos and saw him staring at Kayla with pure hatred in his eyes. His hands were clenched into fists on the defense table. The prosecutor asked a few more questions and then let Kayla step down. She walked past Santos without looking at him, and I could see her shoulders shaking as she cried. The crane operator testified next, and he explained that Santos had called him back around 4 a.m. that night. Santos had offered him $500 instead of $200 if he'd come back and do the prank. The operator said Santos told him I'd changed my mind and wanted to go through with it after all. He seemed excited about the whole thing, not worried or trying to stop anything. The prosecutor asked if Santos had mentioned that I'd left hours earlier. The operator said no. Santos specifically told him not to mention I'd been there earlier trying to stop them. This completely contradicted everything Santos had said at my trial about desperately trying to prevent the tragedy. I watched the jury taking notes and saw several of them glancing at Santos with suspicious looks. The prosecution brought in digital forensics experts who spent hours explaining how the fake text messages were created. They showed the jury side-by-side comparisons of real messages from my phone and the fabricated ones Santos's father had made. The metadata was all wrong. The timestamps didn't match up with actual cell tower data. The message identification numbers didn't exist in the phone company's records. The experts explained that Santos's father would have had the technical knowledge and software to create convincing fakes because of his legal work. They walked the jury through exactly how it was done, pointing out all the telltale signs of fabrication. I could see some jury members shaking their heads in disgust. Santos's father took the stand in his own defense, and I leaned forward to watch. He claimed he was just trying to protect his son from a prosecutor who was being too aggressive. He insisted he believed Santos's version of events and thought I was actually guilty. He made himself sound like a concerned father doing what any parent would do. Then the prosecutor stood up for cross-examination, and everything fell apart for him. She showed him emails where he'd discussed building a narrative and controlling the story. She asked him to explain what he meant by those phrases. He stammered and tried to claim he was just talking about legal strategy. The prosecutor kept pushing, showing more and more evidence of how calculated his plan had been. She asked if creating fake evidence was normal legal strategy. She asked if coaching witnesses to commit perjury was protecting his son or obstructing justice. His lawyer tried objecting several times, but the judge overruled most of them. By the time the prosecutor finished, Santos's father looked destroyed. His career as a lawyer was clearly over no matter what the jury decided. During a break in testimony, I walked out to use the bathroom and saw Santos standing in the hallway with his father. We made eye contact for the first time since my case got dismissed. He stared at me for a second, then quickly looked away. I felt this strange mix of anger and pity because he'd thrown away our entire friendship. He'd destroyed multiple lives just to avoid taking responsibility for what he did. His father noticed me looking and grabbed Santos's arm, pulling him away before either of us could say anything. I watched them disappear around a corner and realized I didn't even know what I would have said to him if we'd spoken. After 2 weeks of testimony, the prosecution rested their case. Santos's defense team put on a weak attempt at a defense, claiming everything had been a misunderstanding. They argued Santos genuinely believed I was responsible and his father was just trying to help. The jury looked completely skeptical. Even Santos's own lawyer seemed to know it was hopeless. During closing arguments, the prosecutor focused on how deliberate the conspiracy had been. She talked about the lives that were damaged by their lies. The defense attorney tried to paint Santos as a confused kid who made a mistake, but nobody was buying it. The jury went out to deliberate. 6 hours later, they came back with guilty verdicts on all counts for both Santos and his father. Santos's mother screamed and had to be escorted out of the courtroom by security. I felt relieved but not satisfied because Mr. Smith was still dead. Nothing could undo the trauma of the last year or bring him back to his family. My parents grabbed me in a tight hug while my lawyer shook hands with the prosecutor. 2 weeks later, we all returned to court for sentencing. The judge asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement, and I said yes. I walked up to the microphone and talked about the months I'd spent believing I was going to prison for something I didn't do. I described the nightmares that still woke me up at night. I talked about the therapy I needed to process what happened. I explained how hard it was to trust anyone after 6 people I considered friends had betrayed me so completely. I looked directly at Santos and told him he didn't just betray me. He betrayed everything we'd built together since we were kids. I told him I tried to stop the prank because I cared about him and didn't want him to get hurt. Mrs. Smith gave her statement next, talking about her husband and how the lies had prevented her from getting real answers for months. She described what it was like to lose him and then watch people cover up the truth about his death. Several jury members from the trial were in the courtroom watching, and I saw some of them wiping their eyes. The judge looked at Santos and his father before announcing the sentences. He called their actions a calculated assault on the justice system itself. Santos got 2 years in county jail, plus 3 years probation for perjury and conspiracy. His father received 4 years in state prison for obstruction of justice and witness tampering, plus permanent loss of his law license. Santos cried during the sentencing, finally showing real emotion instead of the fake performance from my trial. His mother sobbed in the gallery while deputies led both of them away in handcuffs. I walked out of that courtroom knowing justice had been served, but feeling empty because none of it brought Mr. Smith back or erased what I'd been through. A week later, I sat in the same courtroom watching Jax, Kayla, Holden, and Estelle stand before the judge for their sentencing. They'd all taken plea deals and admitted to lying under oath. The judge looked at each of them before speaking. He said they were getting probation, 200 hours of community service each, and suspended jail sentences that would disappear if they completed their terms without problems. He told them they were only getting this break because they eventually told the truth and helped convict the people actually responsible. I sat there trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me wanted them to suffer more for what they did to me. Another part understood they were scared kids who got manipulated by Santos's father. My lawyer leaned over and whispered that their cooperation was the only reason Santos and his father got convicted. Without them flipping, the fake texts might have stood up in court. I nodded but still felt weird about them walking out of there basically free while I'd spent months thinking I was going to prison. After the hearing ended, my parents drove me to meet with a civil attorney about suing Santos's family. The lawyer had an office downtown with fancy furniture and law books everywhere. He listened to our whole story and looked through all the documents my dad brought. Then he explained we had a really strong case for damages. We could sue for the money my parents spent on legal fees, my therapy costs, and emotional pain. He said we'd probably win and get a good amount of money from them. But then he warned us that a lawsuit would take years to finish. We'd have to give depositions, go to more court hearings, and basically stay connected to this whole mess for a long time. My parents told him they wanted me to decide since I was the one who went through it. I asked if I could think about it and talk to my therapist first. That night I couldn't sleep thinking about whether to sue or not. Part of me wanted Santos's family to pay for what they did. But another part just wanted to move on and stop thinking about any of this. I had my therapy appointment 2 days later and spent the whole session talking about the lawsuit decision. My therapist asked me what I really wanted for my future. Did I want to spend the next few years fighting in court? Or did I want to focus on building a new life? She reminded me that moving forward didn't mean forgetting what happened or letting them off easy. It meant choosing not to let them control my time and energy anymore. After that session, I told my parents I didn't want to sue. My dad looked surprised but said he understood. My mom hugged me and said she was proud of me for thinking about my own healing first. We called the attorney and told him we weren't moving forward with the case. May came around and I finished my last assignments for remote learning. The school called to say I could walk at graduation with my class if I wanted. The principal said they'd make sure I felt comfortable and safe. I thanked them but said no. I didn't want to be the center of attention or deal with people staring and whispering. Instead, my parents set up a small ceremony at our house. My mom ordered a cake and my dad hung up decorations. They handed me my diploma in our living room and we took pictures in the backyard. It felt more real than walking across a stage in front of hundreds of people who probably still weren't sure if I was guilty or not. After the ceremony, my parents took me to my favorite restaurant downtown. We sat in a booth by the window and ordered way too much food. My dad made a toast about being proud of how I handled everything. My mom started crying happy tears. For the first time in a year, I felt like maybe things could actually be okay. Maybe I could have a normal future after all. That summer, I threw myself into college applications. I spent hours every day working on essays and filling out forms. My therapy appointments continued twice a week. My therapist helped me process everything that happened without letting it take over my whole identity. She said I couldn't forget the betrayal, but I could choose not to let it define who I became. The hardest part was writing my main college essay. I stared at the blank screen for days trying to figure out what to say. Finally, I started writing about truth and how long it sometimes takes to come out. I wrote about learning to believe in yourself even when everyone else doubts you. I wrote about strength and moving forward after your whole world falls apart. My English teacher from sophomore year agreed to read it and said it was the most powerful essay she'd ever seen from a student. In August, I submitted applications to 6 different schools. My top choice was a state university about 3 hours away, far enough that I could start completely fresh, close enough that I could visit my parents on weekends if I wanted. I tried not to think about it too much after hitting submit. Instead, I focused on my therapy work and spending time with my family. September came and went. October arrived, and I still hadn't heard anything. Then one day in early November, a thick envelope showed up in the mail with the university logo on it. My hands shook as I opened it. The first line said, "Congratulations on my acceptance." I read it 3 times to make sure it was real. This felt like actual proof that I had a future beyond the nightmare of the last year. My parents came home from work and found me sitting on the couch staring at the letter. When I showed them, my mom burst into tears and grabbed me in a huge hug. My dad's eyes got watery too. We ordered pizza and celebrated like it was the best news we'd ever gotten. It was the first truly good thing that happened to us in over a year. Before leaving for college in January, I drove to the cemetery where Mr. Smith was buried. I'd looked up the location online and bought flowers from the grocery store. I walked through the rows of graves until I found his headstone. I stood there for a long time just looking at his name and the dates. Then I knelt down and put the flowers next to the stone. I told him I was sorry I couldn't stop what happened. I said the people responsible were finally facing real punishment. I promised to live a life that honored his memory by always standing up for truth, even when it was hard. It felt like a private moment of closure that helped me feel ready to actually move forward. A few days later, Mrs. Smith called and invited me to her house. She said she was having a small gathering and really wanted me to be there. When I arrived, about 15 people were sitting in her living room. She stood up and explained that she'd created a scholarship in her husband's name. It would go to students who showed real honesty and moral courage. She looked right at me and asked if I'd help choose the winners each year. I felt honored and told her yes, absolutely. She smiled and said that good things can come from terrible tragedies if we choose to create them. College orientation happened on a freezing January morning. I moved into my dorm room and met my roommate, a guy from 2 hours north who was studying engineering. He seemed nice and normal. When he asked about my high school experience, I kept my answer short. I said it was complicated, but I was really glad to be starting fresh here. He nodded and started talking about his own high school. I decided right then that I'd only tell people my story if I chose to, on my own terms. Nobody here knew what happened, and that felt amazing. I signed up for classes and picked a pre-law program after talking to my advisor. She looked at my application and seemed impressed by my reasons for wanting to study law. I told her my experience with the justice system showed me both how broken it could be and how powerful truth was when it finally came out. She said I had a maturity that most freshmen didn't have. I didn't tell her the full story yet, but I knew eventually I would because it shaped everything about who I wanted to become. 3 months into my first semester, a letter arrived with Jax's return address on it. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won and I tore open the envelope. He wrote that he was in therapy trying to deal with his guilt and shame. He said he thought about what he did every single day. He wasn't asking me to forgive him. He just wanted me to know that he understood how badly he'd hurt me. I sat with the letter for a few days before writing back. I kept my response short. I told him I appreciated his honesty and hoped he found a way to live with the choices he made. I didn't offer friendship or say everything was fine, but I offered a kind of peace, an acknowledgement that we were both trying to move forward from something terrible. A few weeks into November, my roommate showed me an article on his phone about Santos. His mother had filed a motion claiming jail conditions were too harsh for him and that he was struggling with depression. The article included quotes from her about how fragile he was and how the punishment was too severe. I felt my chest tighten reading it, and my first reaction was pure anger that she was trying to paint him as a victim. I called my therapist that afternoon and told her about the article. She listened while I vented about how unfair it felt that Santos might get his sentence reduced after what he did to me. Then she asked me a question that stopped me cold. She wanted to know why I was spending energy monitoring his punishment when I'd already testified and he'd been convicted. She reminded me that his consequences weren't my responsibility anymore, and that my job now was to build my own life, not watch his fall apart. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, and I realized she was right. I closed the article and deleted it from my search history because I didn't need to know what happened to Santos anymore. Thanksgiving break came faster than I expected, and I drove home for the first time since starting college. My mom wanted me to help with grocery shopping the day before the holiday, so we went to the store together. I was pushing the cart down the cereal aisle when I saw Estelle standing by the granola section. She looked up, saw me, and completely froze with a box in her hand. For a second, I thought about turning around and walking away, but something made me stop. I surprised myself by saying hello and asking how she was doing. She stammered for a moment, then put the box down and told me she was okay. She apologized again, and this time it sounded more real than her social media message had. She said she thought about what she did every single day, and that she understood if I never forgave her. I told her I was working on forgiveness, but I wasn't there yet, and that I needed more time. She nodded and said she understood completely. We stood there awkwardly for a few more seconds, then she said she should go. I watched her walk away toward the checkout, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't pure hatred anymore either. When I got back to campus after break, an envelope was waiting in my mailbox. Inside was an invitation to join an honor society for students interested in law and justice. My first semester grades had come in, and I'd earned a spot based on my academic performance and my stated interest in criminal justice reform. The initiation ceremony happened 2 weeks later in one of the older campus buildings. About 30 students showed up, and we listened to several professors talk about the importance of justice work. After the formal part ended, I was standing by the refreshment table when a professor approached me. She introduced herself and said she worked with the Innocence Project, an organization that helps overturn wrongful convictions. We started talking about her work, and she asked what drew me to criminal justice. I told her my story, keeping it brief but honest. Her eyes widened as I explained what happened, and when I finished, she said something that stuck with me. She told me that people like me often make the best advocates because we understand the stakes personally, and we know what it feels like when the system fails. She handed me her card and said to contact her if I ever wanted to get involved with her work. In January, I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped people navigate the criminal justice system. The clinic was run by law students and supervised by practicing attorneys, and they needed volunteers to do intake interviews and help with paperwork. My first day, I sat across from a woman whose son had been falsely accused of assault. She was crying while trying to explain the evidence that proved his innocence, and nobody in the system seemed to care. I listened to her whole story, took detailed notes, and promised her we'd do everything we could to help. When I brought her case to the supervising attorney, he agreed to take it on. 2 weeks later, I saw the woman again when she came back to thank us. She grabbed my hand and told me I was the first person who actually believed her when she said her son was innocent. I felt something click into place in that moment. I was turning my trauma into purpose, using what happened to me to help other people. This felt like real healing, not just survival. By the time winter break rolled around, I'd been seeing my therapist weekly for over a year. During our December session, she told me she thought I was doing well enough to reduce our meetings to once a month. She said she was proud of my progress and reminded me that healing wasn't a straight line. I'd still have hard days and setbacks, but I'd built skills to handle them now. I thanked her for everything she'd done, for helping me through the darkest period of my life when I thought I'd never feel normal again. She smiled and said I'd done the hard work myself. She just gave me tools. As I left her office that day, I felt lighter than I had in months. In February, I heard through someone who still lived in my hometown that Santos was released early for good behavior. He'd served 14 months of his 2-year sentence, and he was getting out on probation. My stomach dropped when I heard the news, and I immediately felt anxious about him being free. I called my therapist even though it wasn't our regular session time, and she talked me through it. She reminded me that Santos was on probation with strict conditions, and if he violated any of them, he'd go right back to jail. She also told me I could get a restraining order if I felt unsafe. I decided not to do that because I didn't want to give him any more space in my life. I told myself I'd focus on my own future and not worry about his, though I made a mental note to be more alert when I went home on breaks. During spring semester, my criminal justice professor asked if I'd be willing to speak to a high school class about wrongful accusations and the justice system. The class was studying criminal law, and she thought my perspective would be valuable. I was nervous about it, but I agreed because I thought maybe my story could help students understand the real consequences of lying and false testimony. The day of the talk, I stood in front of 30 teenagers and told them what happened to me. I explained how 6 people I trusted destroyed my life with coordinated lies, how the fake evidence almost sent me to prison, and how the truth eventually came out. After I finished, the teacher opened it up for questions. Several students approached me afterward saying they'd never thought about how false testimony destroys real lives. One girl told me she'd been planning to lie to protect a friend who'd done something illegal, but after hearing my story, she was going to tell the truth instead. I left that classroom feeling like I'd actually made a difference. In April, I learned through the same hometown contact that Santos's father had been released from prison after serving 2 years. He was working as a paralegal now since he couldn't practice law anymore after being disbarred. The contact also mentioned that his wife had divorced him while he was in prison. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing there had been real consequences for what he did, but mostly I just felt tired of the whole situation. I was ready to stop defining myself by what they did to me. Every time I heard news about Santos or his father, it pulled me back into that nightmare, and I didn't want to live there anymore. As my freshman year ended in May, I realized something surprising. I'd gone entire weeks without thinking about the trial, and when I did think about it, the pain wasn't as sharp anymore. I was making real friends at college who knew my whole story and cared about me anyway. My grades were excellent, and I was finding real purpose in my advocacy work at the legal aid clinic. The trauma would always be part of my history, but it wasn't my entire identity anymore. I was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who could use their pain to help other people. Over the summer, I got an internship with a criminal defense attorney who specialized in cases involving false testimony and fabricated evidence. She'd heard about my story through the legal aid clinic and reached out asking if I wanted to work for her. The job involved reviewing case files, interviewing witnesses, and helping identify inconsistencies in testimony. She told me my perspective was valuable because I'd lived through a false accusation, so I knew what to look for. On my 3rd day, I caught a major inconsistency in a witness statement that the attorney had missed. She was impressed and told me I had a real gift for this work. I was good at spotting lies because I'd been buried under them for months. This felt like reclaiming power from what happened to me, taking the worst experience of my life and turning it into something useful. One night in late July, I sit at my desk with a blank piece of paper in front of me and start writing a letter to myself from 3 years ago to the kid standing in that parking lot at 2 a.m. trying to stop his friends from doing something stupid. I write that he's about to go through absolute hell, that people he trusts completely are going to destroy his life to save themselves, that he'll spend months believing he's going to prison for something he didn't do. I write that standing up for what's right, even when everyone votes against him, was the correct choice and he should never doubt that. I tell him the truth does eventually come out, even when it takes time and even when it feels like no one will ever believe him. I write that he'll survive this and become someone stronger, someone who uses pain to help other people instead of letting it break him. I fold the letter and put it in my desk drawer where I can see it whenever I need to remember how far I've traveled from that nightmare. As August arrives and I start packing for my sophomore year, I realize I'm actually excited about going back to the school instead of dreading it. My partner helps me load boxes into my car, and they know everything about what happened to me, and they're still here. which feels like proof that I'm more than just the worst thing that ever happened to me. My roommate from last year texts asking if I want to grab dinner when I get back to campus, and I have study group friends who actually care about me as a person. Mrs. Smith sends me an email saying she heard about my internship work and that her husband would be genuinely proud of who I'm becoming, someone who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. I write back thanking her for believing in me when most people didn't. I'm not the same person I was before Santos and the others betrayed me, before I sat in that courtroom watching my entire life fall apart. But I'm someone I actually respect now. I'm someone who survived real injustice and chose to turn that experience into something meaningful instead of letting it poison me. The scars from what they did are still visible when I look close enough, but they're evidence that I made it through, not evidence that I'm damaged beyond repair.